primary insight that we have from Audre Lorde's Age, Race, Class, and Sex is how sexual orientation and sexuality can intersect with issues of Black feminism. So in the beginning, she just notes, look, we are different. And in a capitalist society, there is always a need for surplus labor that can then be exploited. Difference is a mechanism by which we mark out who is surplus labor and who is not. In our society, this surplus group is made of Black and third world people, working class people, older people, and women. Now, not only do marginalized people have to be subject to subordination, but they're also expected to explain their subordination in terms acceptable to the oppressor, So this is a constant drain, she argues, of energy, which might be better used in redefining ourselves or devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. Sometimes you might hear today this issue of sea lioning, usually talked about in the context of online discussions where someone's constantly asking, well, what do you think of oh, I'm just trying to have a debate. I'm just having a talk. I'm just having this. One of the issues there is that one might not be legitimately interested in a debate and largely just trying to use up your time. We'll see this again when we think of, when we talk about our epistemic injustice section, as this can happen and be quite exploitative. So there's also here an institutionalization, an institutionalized rejection of difference. So what does this mean? Well, we reject what's different to us. We've been programmed to do so, and we treat the other, those who are different from us, with fear and loathing. We answer difference in 3 different ways. We ignore it if we can, or we copy it if we think it's dominant, or we destroy it if we think it's subordinate and we can no longer ignore it. Many of the isms, racism, sexism, and so on, points out to differences and distorts our relations with each other. We claim the barriers to recognizing these differences are insurmountable, or we deny that any barriers exist at all. So someone maybe who claims, I don't see racism, I don't see color, I don't see any barriers at all, or we have colorblind policies, so therefore racism can't exist. She argues that this results in a voluntary isolation on behalf of activists, or maybe false and treacherous connections between things. One powerful idea that is found within this article is the idea of the mythical norm. So in the US, this is a white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, financially secure, and who might be considered kind of the standard, quote unquote, or ideal citizen. Now, those who lie outside this mythical norm are generally defined by their lacking one of these essential features. In the context of feminism, white women tend to ignore the differences of race, sexual preference, class, and age. And when they talk about things like sisterhood, and Lorde wants to push back to say, look, there is no experience fully covered by sisterhood. Black women tend not to be discussed in women's studies literature, or in literature courses, or in women's studies as a whole, even though we find those spaces try to be fighting against particular gendered oppression. And there's kind of convenient excuses here, one of which is that maybe these courses, the argument is, can only be taught by people of color, and there just are not any people of color that can teach them. Or perhaps the works are just too difficult to understand, and so students will not understand them. Or maybe classes just can't get into them because the experiences are just too different from the student body. And these are problems, but ultimately they serve to silence or marginalize or neglect issues that affect women of color. Lorde's diagnosis here is that white women just don't want to see Black women as women and different from themselves. And this requires that white women see their complexities rather than as familiar stereotypes. So if white women were to really see Black women and really recognize the ways in which they're different, she wants to say that this would require them to see Black women in their complexities as opposed to just simply stereotypes that are picked out by the dominant racist culture. So the different effects of patriarchy can happen here. So patriarchy, in the way that it intersects with racism, can have different effects for women and different effects for Black women and white women. There's also this idea of pick-me women that I think is relevant here. If you've never heard of this concept of pick-me women or pick-me girls, it's the idea that some women will throw other women under the bus for the pursuit of being accepted by men. You can think of this similarly, that white women on average, according to Lorde, they enact or reinforce white supremacist ideas so that they will perhaps have a role in patriarchy. So there's these distinct differences in the way that Black and white women experience the world. So Black women have to generally separate the needs of their oppressor from their own legitimate conflicts within one's community. So there might be pressure to advocate for issues that affect particularly Black women, but then Black women might be in a position to second guess themselves, thinking, wait a second, am I just pushing against Black men because this is what the racist society is compelling me to do so? Am I somehow falling into the hands of the oppressor? Or is this actually a legitimate concern or issue of mine? And that kind of issue, that competing, that competing commitment or tension in allegiance and pressures of white supremacy just don't exist for white women, certainly not in the same way. Black women and men also have a shared racist oppression, and that's not something that white women experience. White women also face the pitfall of seduction into joining the oppressor under the pretense of sharing power. That's where I pick up this idea of the pick-me women. So this doesn't exist for Black women. Racial otherness is always a visible reality for Black women. For white women, if you are good or pretty or sweet or quiet enough, if you hate the right people, if you marry the right men, then the promise is that you can coexist in a relative peace with patriarchy. And this happens there's this article that happened in the Atlantic about a woman, I'll put it on the website, but as a woman who was part of the alt-right, and after a while she realized that even though she was endorsing a lot of white supremacist, very far-right kind of views, she eventually realized that this was not a good circumstance for her, that she was being subject to lots of sexism, and she eventually got out of the alt-right. So that's an example. Black women deal with violence and hatred in all parts of life, not only on picket lines or in dark alleys or places where they verbalize their resistance. Violence is weaved through the daily tissues of their living, in the supermarket, in the classroom, the elevator, the clinic, the schoolyard, from everyone, the plumber, the baker. Violence is omnipresent. And as I record this, all the protests happening for the murder of George Floyd are going on, and I think that just makes this all the more clear and obvious and present. I also put up a video of Senator Flowers talking about the issue that stand your ground laws have for people in her community, for women like her, considering the effects that these stand your ground laws have on the survivability of their children, of their Black children. So this can have a particular effect for Black women who are lesbians. So given the pressures of racism in a white supremacist society, issues of women are ignored or sidelined, according to Lorde. So some Black women still refuse to recognize that we're also oppressed as women, and that sexual hostility against Black women is practiced not only by the white racist society, but is also implemented within our Black communities as well. Women of color are the lowest paid wage earners in America. Black women suffer frequent assault. Women hating as a recourse of the powerlessness is sapping strength from Black communities. So women become a target of powerlessness of those in the Black community. Widespread homophobia, or produces a fear of being accused of being a lesbian, which leads many Black women into testifying against themselves of not aligning with feminist goals. Heterosexual Black women often ignore or even discount the work and existence of Black lesbians, even though Black lesbians have an active participation in anti-racist activism, partly due to fear of Black male assault, she wants to argue, but also in part due to a fear that women-identified Black women, being no longer dependent upon men, might reorder the whole concept of certain social relationships, and that becomes too scary and too destabilizing for a community that is already struggling against oppression due to race. So Black lesbians then are in a position where they're considered un-Black. If you've read this article, you'd find that Audre Lorde is a lesbian, that there's a kind of idea that Black lesbians are consorting with the enemy, or that being a lesbian is, quote, a white woman's problem, where in fact Black lesbians are particularly valuable in spearheading movements against violence against Black women and children. So her kind of final conclusion amidst all this is that as women must root out internalized patterns of oppression, but must also recognize the differences among women who are also equals. And these are the variety of ways that being Black and being a woman intersects in ways that need to be taken seriously by feminist theory. And we'll revisit some of these themes throughout the course. I've tried to pepper the course with issues pertaining to the Black community and the trans community and people of color. So we will, these insights and lessons will be a present thread throughout the rest of the course.